Well, the response was, in my opinion, sort of overwhelmingly positive. I think all of us sort of old timers who were at Congress in 1986 remember those 1,600 nurses waiting in line to enter the ballroom to take that inaugural exam. It takes a while to check in 1,600 people. They kind of all filled up the lobby outside of the ballroom, and then they spilled over down into the escalator, and the escalators had to be turned off.
You're listening to the ONS podcast, where ONS Voices Talk Cancer, a resource from the Oncology Nursing Society. Through conversations with subject matter experts, we examine the important issues in oncology nursing, from new treatments to patient-centered research to advancements in clinical practice. Join us as we hear from nurses in all facets of oncology care, from bench to bedside and everywhere in between. Hello, and welcome to the ONS podcast. I'm your host, Clara Beaver, member of the ONS 50th Anniversary Committee. Today, I'm joined by Cyndi Miller-Murphy, the first Executive Director of the Oncology Nursing Certification Corporation, known as ONCC, and Tony Ellis, the current Executive Director of ONCC. We'll be discussing the history of ONCC and certification in oncology nursing, the current certification landscape, and its future. This episode is part of a series celebrating the 50th anniversary of ONS. Throughout 2025, we'll feature monthly episodes exploring ONS's rich history and promising future. Thanks for joining us today, Cyndi and Tony. To start, can each of you describe why you think certification is important in the oncology nursing field? Cyndi?
Hi, Clara. Thanks so much for having me and letting me take this little walk down memory lane. Oncology nursing is a highly specialized area with a broad, well-defined body of knowledge. And it's essential for employees and healthcare consumers to be able to identify nurses who've demonstrated that they possess the knowledge that's necessary to practice competently in the specialty. Nurses who become certified take that essential step to publicly demonstrate their knowledge. And I believe this makes them a known commodity, so to speak. A nurse who isn't certified may have the same knowledge and skills, but they haven't demonstrated that in any standardized way, which is a greater risk for an employer to take. Nurses who are certified are more marketable.
Perfect. Yeah, I agree with you on that. Tony, do you have anything else to add?
Sure. Thanks for having me. And I'm pleased to be in the company of Cyndi Miller-Murphy again. So this is a real treat for me as well. And I would echo what Cyndi shared and kind of add to that oncology nursing is an area of high stakes patient care. And a core purpose of certification is to safeguard the public. This is certainly an area of healthcare that benefits from having that role of professional certification being played, from the knowledge requirements to the practice hours that a nurse must have, to the performance on the exam and continued competence required to maintain the certification. Our certifications hold nurses to a higher standard, which helps protect the public in the care that they provide. Additionally, certification serves to increase the professionalism and standardization of the practice. It elevates the certified nurse as a member of the care team and enhances their credibility with their colleagues and their patients both. We learned that in a study that we did on the value of certification in 2023. And in that same study, 96% of respondents indicated that holding an ONCC certification enhances their breadth and depth of knowledge. So as a shameless plug, that study report is available on our website, oncc.org. in the About ONCC section, and has some great information for nurses that are either currently certified or might be interested in certification. And lastly, I'd say that certification creates a means to codify new subspecialties within the space as they emerge. And we've certainly done that in the past and will continue to do that in the future. It helps both us in ONCC and organizations that serve oncology nurses and the certificates themselves stay on top of the profession as it evolves.
Thank you both. As a certified nurse, I agree with both of you. I really feel that my certification has helped me really become a better nurse and to care more for my patients. So thank you both for your work in helping us become certified oncology nurses. The Oncology Nurse Society was founded in 1975. Several years later, in the mid-1980s, ONS created a committee to explore certification. Cyndi, we'll direct these next few questions to you for your perspective on experiencing that history. What was happening in the oncology nursing profession at the time that drove the development of certification?
Well, first, there was rapid growth in all nursing specialties and certifications at the time. But in cancer care in particular, there have been great strides in the detection and treatment of cancer. Healthcare institutions were opening specialty units, and along with this, greater numbers of nurses were identifying with the specialty. Oncology was no longer just a little slice of that broad area that we used to identify as medical surgical nursing. And as treatments increased, so did the need for supportive care. And oncology nurses took a leadership role in symptom management and patient education. So this is why a group of, 200 nurses got together at an American Cancer Society conference back in 1980 to discuss the desire for certification in oncology. Nurses wanted a way to verify their specialized knowledge and skills. They wanted to raise the level of professionalism, and ONS was the most appropriate organization to develop the certifications. And by 1983, a survey of members revealed strong interest in the specialty certification in oncology.
Very nice. So what kind of work went into developing the OCN, which is the Oncology Certified Nurse, the first ONCC certification? What challenges did you face during that process?
First, I have to point out that although I was hired in 1986, I was hired on the ONS side. I was the director of education from 1986 to 1989. And I wasn't directly involved with certification during those years when ONCC was establishing the first exam. Major credit for that work goes to Pearl Moore and the early volunteer leaders of ONCC. It's important to point out that there was a tremendous amount of groundwork that needed to be done before the first examination could even be developed. Pearl and those early leaders, those early volunteer leaders, did an incredible job from the outset to ensure the proper structure and function of the certification corporation. They sought legal input and incorporated ONCC. They established essential policies to ensure that the entire process was going to be done properly and meet high standards. And in addition to Pearl, major credit goes to Bobby Schofield, who was the first president of the ONCC board. Bobby served for 4 years, and sadly, Bobby died of cancer just 9 months after her term on the ONCC board ended. But her legacy lives on in ONCC. So aside from establishing the corporation, developing policies, and developing a contract with Educational Testing Services, or ETS, to administer the exam at the time, the first detailed content outline for the OCN exam had to be developed. And I think at the time it was called the core curriculum. Eventually, that became the name of the study guide, one of the books, and we moved over to calling it a content outline. But this is the essential first step in test development for any exam. It was originally completed by a panel of experts, and then it was later verified through research, through a role delineation study. But that was a year or two later when I came on board to ONCC. But it's perfectly acceptable for a first exam to have that developed by an expert panel. Once they had that content down and they could say what was going to be on the exam or what was really important in the practice of oncology nursing and how heavily weighted each of the content areas were, they began to do item writing, that is, developing items or test questions for the exam. And then once they had the items, then they developed the first form of the examination. And a very important piece was developing the passing or the cut score for the exam. And these are all things that must be completed in the proper order if your program is going to meet standards. And despite this being a new program, all the steps were completed according to those standards. Again, it's huge kudos to Pearl and Bobby and all the other original members of the ONCC board and committees. Many times I looked back and realized that their excellent groundwork really made my job a lot easier than it might have been when I started in 1989.
And what was the response from oncology nurses when the OCN was first released?
Well, the response was, in my opinion, sort of overwhelmingly positive. I think all of us sort of old timers who were at Congress in 1986 remember those 1,600 nurses waiting in line to enter the ballroom to take that inaugural exam. So remember, it was a paper and pencil test, and everybody was seated 4 feet apart in a huge ballroom. And as you can imagine, it takes a while to check in 1,600 people to look at their identification and make sure they are registered for the exam. So what happened was they kind of all filled up the lobby outside of the ballroom, and then they spilled over down into the escalator, and the escalators had to be turned off because they couldn't keep moving with all those people sort of jammed in there. That all happened at the Bonaventure Hotel in Los Angeles. And I think it was really exciting. Maybe Tony can correct me if I'm wrong. I think 1,384 nurses passed that first exam. So I would say that was a pretty positive response.
When I took OCN, it was still on paper. And I remember the anxiety of the checking in and waiting to take it. So yeah, I can just imagine being one of those first people taking it. So what a great experience.
I think that the check-in process was something that we smoothed out pretty nicely over the years. Even when we did have huge numbers like that, we learned our lessons, but still a lot less convenient than the way it is today.
Much, yes. What drove the development of other ONCC certifications? Because we have quite a few now. So what drove the development of those?
I think the drivers for each one varied according to the program. The first additional exam that we developed was the AOCN, or the Advanced Oncology Certified Nurse. We established that about a decade after the OCN exam. At that time, the primary advanced practice role for oncology nurses was that of clinical nurse specialist. And the exam turned out to be based on the 5 roles of the oncology CNS. There were many, many master's programs that were in the specialty of oncology. And in most of the cases, they were turning out clinical nurse specialists. And CNSs wanted recognition for their additional knowledge and for the different role that they were playing, in oncology. But as advanced nursing practice in oncology evolved, so did our exams. And eventually, we developed separate exams for the clinical nurse specialists and nurse practitioners, because eventually more and more nurse practitioners were working in oncology. And the original AOCN exam really wasn't targeted at their practice. I think that came maybe even a decade after the AOCN, when those exams were split and there were 2 separate exams. The pediatric exam, the CPON, it was not originally developed at all by ONCC. It had been established and developed by the Association of Pediatric Oncology Nurses, or APON. APON's always been a smaller organization than ONS, and that's because there just aren't as many pediatric oncology nurses as there are adult oncology nurses. So APON had developed the exam, but they began to struggle with the resources needed to maintain the program. And they came to ONCC for assistance. We worked with them and we reached an agreement, and ONCC began developing and administering the CPON exam somewhere in, I think it was about 1999. But in the agreement, we made sure that we maintained a very close relationship with APON, the same way that ONCC had a close relationship with ONS, so that we draw upon APON for our expertise, for our subject matter experts. Again, based on the evolution of practice, that exam eventually became the CPHON exam, because it became clear that most pediatric oncology nurses were also practicing hematology. And so we incorporated that into the exam, just as APON began to incorporate hematology much more into their organization. They became APHON. As for some of the other exams like the BMTCN and the CBCN program, these were developed based on demand due to the subspecialized nature of the knowledge needed to practice in those areas, and because of the high number of nurses who do practice in those subspecialties. So I think in summary, although there were kind of different routes that we took to develop each of those exams, all of them came about as practice evolved and changed. And so that the exams would actually, the certifications would actually represent current practice in those specialties.
As the oncology nursing specialty has grown over the past 50 years, can you describe the challenges that created for certification? Cyndi, let's start with your perspective from the early years, and then Tony can talk about the more recent challenges.
I believe the biggest challenges we faced came in making changes to the processes that nurses had to follow to get certified or renew certification, rather than any new programs or any other changes. The first big change in process was the implementation of computer-based testing. As technology evolved, it was important to leverage it to enhance our programs. It's hard to imagine, but when I started out with ONCC, we did everything on paper. Applications for certification and recertification were completed on paper by hand and mailed in, processed by hand. The test, of course, was paper, pencil, administered in large ballrooms, as we mentioned, with large groups of people. Even our bank of items, which this just kind of blows me away today to think back and think that our items were kept on index cards in boxes. They were secured at educational testing services, but still they were all in paper and we did all hand processing. So knowing when to move to computer-based testing was a bit challenging. We were at a point where the technology, it was there and it was ready and ONCC had the resources. But, with all major changes, the risk is always, if you build it, will they come? And once we build it, can we maintain it? So after much research and deliberation, the board finally made the decision. I think it was discussed probably over a period of about 2 years. And we had gotten input from nurses. But once we made the final announcement and the decision, so many nurses expressed their opposition. And they were very upset that we were putting them at a disadvantage because it's hard to imagine now, but they told us they didn't know how to use a computer. And I think there were people in situations at that time who maybe weren't very familiar with computers. They've become such a part of our life today that it's hard to imagine that, but it was the case. And if I recall correctly, the year before we implemented computer-based testing, we had the highest ever number of candidates because we had announced it and said it's coming. And all of these nurses came in to take it in paper pencil because they were afraid to take it on the computer. People were afraid they'd hit a wrong key and they'd shut down the computer and they wouldn't know what to do. And the anxiety was quite high. When you think of it now, it's so advantageous to pick whatever date you want to go to a testing center, to not have to travel, to get an immediate score. How could that be bad? But it was new to people and people were really afraid. Change can evoke high anxiety. The other big change that we made was the move to the individual learning needs assessment for renewal of certification. And this change, it created similar challenges. We worked really, really hard and tried to develop a method to assure continuing competence that went beyond just the accumulation of continuing education hours. And we felt that ILNA, the Individual Learning Needs Assessment, was a great improvement. We had engaged a lot of experts in the area. We consulted with other organizations. But again, some of the constituency was not so sure. They had been very familiar with the old way of renewing certification. And I think any major change like this is going to raise anxiety, especially for something as high stakes as professional certification. People worked hard for it and they were afraid of losing it. So both of these changes were big challenges and they were a little bumpy, especially for the ONCC staff. And I say most especially for our customer service staff, but they handled it beautifully. We have to keep in mind that they were helping the candidates daily with lots of questions and lots of concerns, emails, calls about both when we went to computer-based testing and when we moved to the ILNA method. Everybody was really anxious about doing it and doing it the right way. So the customer service staff had to really deal with them. And by the same token, the staff was also adapting because it was all new processes and all new ways of doing things internally also. But they handled it beautifully, and I was very proud of them. Frederick Douglass said, if there's no struggle, there is no progress. And I believe we had a bit of a struggle with these changes, but I also believe we made a great deal of progress.
Perfect. Tony, what about some more recent challenges that you've had to deal with?
Well, it feels almost unfair that Cyndi's had to carry the torch for the conversation so far, but I loved hearing that history. And Cyndi, I've said it before, I'll say it again. You're to be thanked and applauded for the foundation that you built in ONCC and the programs and the transitions that you helped the organization make in your time as executive director. I still hear stories about the paper. And not too long ago, we did a cleanup of some of the last of our paper files in offsite storage. And I got to go through boxes of some of those old paper files. And so could definitely see the magnitude of work that happened when everything was on paper in the office. And of course, have worked in other organizations with paper and pencil tests. So the work that was done there, the improvements that happened to create a better experience for our certified nurses is definitely recognized. And so much change over the last few decades. I also still hear about the ILNA today, the pain that some people felt or thought was there with the transition to that approach. But the ILNA approach to continued competence was so ahead of its time when it was implemented. And it is still looked at today by other organizations that are trying to create ways to have greater alignment between what they require of their certificates for professional development or continuing education for renewal and what that individual needs in topic areas to actually stay on top of, the changes in their practice. So it was well ahead of its time, and it's a fantastic aspect of our programs. So the no pain, no gain, it was worth it for sure. So thank you for that change as well. I joined ONCC in 2019, and a few things have happened since I've been with the organization. One thing that we've looked at, that we continue to look at every so often, is our definition of nursing practice. So when Cyndi talked about creating policies and procedures and how some of those things have to be looked at and adjusted over time, we have taken a look at how we define oncology nursing practice for purposes of earning the practice hours required as for eligibility for either initial or renewal of certification. And that has evolved a bit over time as oncology nurses have taken on new roles. Probably the most substantial thing that I've experienced since I've been with ONCC is the impact of the COVID pandemic on oncology nursing and certification, and of course, healthcare in general. We saw many oncology nurses pulled into other areas of care during that time as the need required. And also things slowed down in oncology practice because patient screenings were slowed dramatically. Patients couldn't come into the institutions for procedures, those kinds of things. Some oncology nurses left the profession because of the pressure and the strain of the work during that time, and others that were poised to retire didn't, so that they could help fill the need or came out of retirement. The impact on certification at the time, initially it was immediate because testing centers closed down and we were not able to offer our exams for our certifications for individuals that were already scheduled or wanted to test. It only took us about 2 months, however, to be placed on a special list of highly necessary examinations for the test centers. And we were able to start testing again by mid to late May after everything closed down in March of that year. So we were back up and running. But the continued impact, I think, of what we saw on certification was felt several years following when the world emerged out of the pandemic. And that was really related to those that were new to the profession. They needed to work to make up lost time on preceptorship or other on-the-job training, as well as formal education and experience that was needed to prepare them for certification and meet eligibility. I think we saw a dip in our scores on the exams that I think can be pretty directly attributed to that people were just trying to get in, do what needed to be done, but they were having to play catch up on some of the both kind of book knowledge as well as on this on-site practice of oncology nursing that would prepare them for certification. We've since moved out of that. And of course, our certification numbers continue to grow for all of our programs. And so I think as a profession, we've pretty much cleared that hurdle. One of the other areas that I would mention is that we've seen the maturation and change in some aspects of the practice that are now leading to the development of new certifications or kind of filling spaces that in the past, Cyndi described some changes that were made that have reemerged as needing certifications. I think we're going to talk about that in a little bit. So I hold some of that until we get to that point in the conversation. But to your question specifically, the pace of change in oncology care is really the challenge for certification programs proper right now. There's so many wonderful advances, oncology treatments and drugs that are coming to the market that are being used in non-oncology settings and other advancements in the practice, that keeping up with that change puts pressure on certification programs because they must validate knowledge in practice that has become standard. It has to have been in the practice long enough that whatever the content, whatever the practice is that you're testing on, that there is one single correct answer. So you can't necessarily test on the very latest of what has come to the market or to the practice. The other flip side of that is that pace of change, the new emerging things in the practice create opportunities for other kinds of credentials. And that's something that I know is also coming up in our discussion in a few minutes. And it's something that ONCC is working on. So I'll save some of that for a little bit later.
So Cyndi, as we wrap up with the past, you did mention you were the first staff member of ONCC coming from ONS, and you really led the certification corporation as the executive director for decades. What would you say you're most proud of and why?
I think in general, I'm most proud that ONCC wasn't afraid to make those big changes, to embrace the technological advances and to use them to enhance the programs and processes. I think we always maintained an awareness of environmental trends and evolution and continued to also evolve. ONCC was recognized and well respected within the professional certification arena. Many organizations sought our counsel and input as they explored new programs and processes. I was just always very, very proud of our reputation in the industry.
I just want to say thank you for all the hard work that you did and the support you gave all the oncology nurses that wanted certification and really fought for certification. So thank you for your hard work for that.
Well, you are very welcome. And I have to tell you, it was my pleasure. I enjoyed every one of my 33 years, I believe. It was quite a fun ride.
Tony, next, we're going to talk to you. So the next few questions really involve the ONCC present and future direction. So the body of knowledge in oncology nursing is constantly growing, like you already stated. Many oncology nurses are becoming increasingly subspecialized. How do you balance the need to provide general certification that validate a broad body of knowledge with the desire of nurses to recognize knowledge in more specialized areas?
Yes, this is a constant balancing act and something that we use a couple of different strategies for. Certainly recently, there comes a point for sure at which you have to address the size and complexity of the body of knowledge for any given program. And that's extremely relevant for a program like the Oncology Certified Nurse or the OCN, which is, of course, the flagship generalist certification for ONCC and oncology nurses. That body of knowledge is large and continues to grow. So there's a couple of ways that we've worked to address that. The first, and I think foremost recently, is we've partnered in the last couple of years with ONS to update the generalist and advanced oncology nurse competency models. So when you think about, as Cyndi mentioned earlier, in the processes to develop a certification exam, you have to determine the body of knowledge and then establish what's going to be on the test itself. The examination is a sampling of everything that needs to be known and be able to be performed in the role of an oncology nurse, for example. So it's a subset in some ways of the full breadth of the competencies, what a competency model would cover. So by partnering with ONS to update those standards for the generalist oncology nurse, it gives us a shared foundation for ONS educational offerings, anyone else that wants to develop educational offerings for an oncology nurse, institutions to use those competencies to guide professional development and training of their oncology nurses. And then also for ONCC to use that as one of the primary sources in conducting the role delineation work and the surveys that go into updating the OCN exam test content outline at each cycle. So we're working off of the same sheet of music, but at the same time, there's still that appropriate separation between what people are doing in the education of oncology nurses and what we have on the exams themselves. But that increased alignment will make it easier for both intentional and organic increases in nurse preparation and preparedness for certification, be easier for them to find educational sessions and materials that align to the topics that are on the test content outline. So when they go to create a preparation plan for themselves, they'll be able to find those resources more easily. One of the other things that we're doing is looking at other types of credentials. So one of those is the certificates of added qualification, or CAQs, that ONCC offers in partnership with ONS for chemoimmunotherapy and radiation. Those kinds of other credentials can break down the growing body of knowledge into smaller milestone credentials that enable nurses to gain knowledge and get recognition for that knowledge while they build up their bench strength to go after the OCN certification. It gives them a way to chunk things and make progress so that by the time they're ready to start preparing for the OCN and tackle that full body of knowledge, they have the confidence and some validation of their knowledge in key parts of that test content outline. So creating additional certificates of added qualification and other kinds of credentials is one of the things that we're looking at that will help. The last thing that I would say is that there are times when aspects of the practice emerge and mature into a body of knowledge that just warrants a whole new certification. And that we've done that before, as Cyndi mentioned, with CBCN and BMTCN. And I think you're about to ask me about that going forward. So I'll wait for that question before I say more.
We've already talked about OCN currently certifies or recertifies nurses in about 8 specialty areas or roles. Can you give us any clues? Are there any new programs under exploration or on the horizon that we may be seeing come from ONCC?
We are developing several new programs now that will be available in beta by early 2026, if not sooner. So beta is that first exam that is offered, and the evaluation of that, the statistical analysis of that exam is a little bit different than our current exams that are out there. So just want to make sure people know that the first version that goes out won't get immediate results like our other exams do now. There will be a waiting period, but we do hope people will take us up on the offer to be part of the beta group for these 2 new programs. Both of them came out of competency modeling work that was done that I mentioned previously with ONS that indicated there was something needed there. And so we're moving forward. The first is kind of the recreation of something we had in the past, but for new reasons, I believe. And that is an advanced oncology nurse certification. This certification will address the master's or higher academically prepared oncology nurse, but that is not a nurse practitioner. So both the original AOCN and the AOCNS certifications are now in what we call retirement. So they're only available for renewal, and you can't get that certification if you don't already have it. But what we have found is that there are thousands and thousands of oncology nurses that are practicing at a level and doing specialized work beyond the scope of the OCN body of knowledge. So at the master's level, PhD, especially with the advent of the DNP, and there is work there. And this really came out of our work to update the advanced oncology nurse competencies. So the new credential, unfortunately, we cannot revive the existing program because it already exists. So the new certification is the Advanced Certified Oncology Nurse, or the ACON certification, and it is suited for those nurses that are practicing at that higher level. Some of these nurses they hold the OCN, but many of them don't. And we continue to get requests for something that will fit their work. So they don't have to go somewhere else and get an advanced certification, which may be required by their institution, but that isn't grounded in their oncology nursing work. And so that's really what this new certification will help address. The second new program that will be coming out, maybe even as early as this year, is an elevation of the radiation oncology certificate course that we do with ONS right now. And this certification is the Certified Radiation Oncology Nurse, or CRON. And this area has seen a lot of change in the last 5 to 6 years. There was the last time we did an RDS to determine updates for the radiation course, it was determined that there hadn't been a lot of change in that practice. Very recently, in the last 2 years, we did a new RDS to update that course and determine that the body of knowledge has grown and it's changed, and that there was more than enough information there that really needed or merited the creation of a certification. And so we'll be offering that as soon as this fall. And we're very excited about being able to offer a certification to recognize the specialized work of radiation oncology nurses. And then finally, more of a teaser than anything else, but oncology nurse navigation is an area that we continue to explore and are evaluating. And so I don't have anything I can share on that just yet, but I do believe we'll have more to say about that in the months to come.
Thank you for sharing that news with us. It's very exciting for those groups of nurses to actually be able to become certified in what they do every day. So thank you, Tony and the ONCC board, for looking at that and helping provide certification for those nurses. So for both of you, do you see specialty certification as more or less important than in the past, and why? And what do you say to nurses who are considering certification? Cyndi, let's start with you, and then Tony will let you share your perspectives.
I believe it's more important than ever for nurses to demonstrate their knowledge. Tony just described all the expansion of knowledge and competencies that are important. I think healthcare in general, nursing in general, and the specialty of oncology are becoming more and more sophisticated and complex every day. Ongoing competence among healthcare professionals is more important than ever. I think nurses who are considering certification should certainly pursue it. They should take a really good look at the exam content, brush up on the areas they're least familiar with, and then show the world what they know. So yes, I think it's more important than ever.
Tony?
Well said, Cyndi. I believe as well that certification will only increase in importance because the field is going to continue to advance and expand. And I think further specialization is definitely something that we're going to see. So our challenge and our pleasure is going to be keeping up with that and providing what nurses need to be able to prove their knowledge and experience to the profession. For those considering certification, similarly, I would encourage you to set a target date and craft your plan. What we've found in talking to nurses over the years that are getting ready for certification or wanting to pursue certification is that setting that goal and creating a study or preparation timeline and plan, including getting a colleague or a friend to hold you accountable to that plan, is a great way to make it happen. Because otherwise, life rushes in, work rushes in, and you do have to carve out time to study and prepare. I would say if your timeline is down the road just a bit, I would encourage you and invite you to watch for information about another new program from ONCC called the Runway Program. It's going to be out later this year. This is not a new certification, but it's more of a scaffolding or structure of learning activities, including mentoring and self-reflection and goal setting that is based on the OCN program requirements, the eligibility requirements, and the oncology nurse generalist competencies that can provide guidance to a nurse that's newer in their profession and on their way to seeking the OCN certification. So more information about that later this year, but certainly support certification, and we'd love to have you as a candidate.
Thank you. Tony, put your binoculars on and tell us where you see oncology nurse certification in 10 or 20 years from now.
Well, 10 to 20 years is a very, very long time in the oncology space with what's going on right now. And certainly as well, given that we're in the age of artificial intelligence, I do believe that there will be new certifications and other credentials that allow oncology nurses to gain and validate their specialized knowledge. And I think there'll be a combination of those that allow them to get the credentials and certifications that they want and need for the work that they do. So our job is to provide those that keep pace with the evolution of the practice. And I think what we're going to see is something more like a constellation of credentials, both certifications and assessment-based certificates that nurses can choose from to create kind of their basket of validated knowledge and experience to show that they know what they're doing and that they're there to provide safe and competent care on the care team. I think that the content of our programs will also have to evolve to address decision-making, information analysis and validation, and other skills that are already part of what nurses do, but I think will become increasingly a core part of the nurse's role as technology takes on new aspects of their work. So the role of the nurse is still going to be critical, but I do think there's going to be changes in what they do in that role. We've already seen a little bit of a shift on the NCLEX exam, for example, with a new component that they use that's based on scenario-based decision-making. And I think that's in response to the shift in nursing a bit. I also believe that our programs are going to be enabled by artificial intelligence for a number of reasons. It will allow us to keep pace with the rapid changes in the practice. It will also help us ensure that our exams and assessments remain secure and credible and keep up with the pace of what's happening in healthcare. And I guess in summary, ultimately, I would like to see us achieve the ONCC vision that oncology care across the continuum is provided by oncology certified professionals. And I think with 10 to 20 years, I believe we can get there.
Cyndi, what are some of your hopes for oncology nurse certification for the future?
My hopes are that the recognition and rewards for nursing certification continue to expand. Nurses who take that professional leap to demonstrate their specialized knowledge deserve recognition. I also hope that the value of nursing certification continues to be realized through its inclusion in institutional norms, standards, and recognition such as Magnet. It's very rare to find a physician who isn't board certified in the specialty in which they practice. And this is driven by institutional norms and standards. I hope for the same standardization for nursing certification.
Thank you both for joining me today to discuss ONCC's past, present, and future. It's been great talking with both of you. And I'd just like to make sure that people know that ONCC does have a booth at the 50th ONS Congress. So feel free to stop by to learn more about certification. If you're wanting to take that test or learn more about ILNA or anything involved with certification, they would be happy to talk to you about it. Thank you again and have a great day.
Thank you for listening to the ONS podcast. Tell us about your favorite part in this episode by leaving a review wherever you download your podcast. For more resources and information about oncology nursing, visit us at ons.org and ons.org/voice. The ideas and opinions shared in this episode represent those of the guest and not necessarily ONS.